Blood from the wounded Apache boy stained Sarah's trembling hands as she worked through the night to save him, her unborn child kicking beneath her ribs. At dawn, her heart stopped as 80 mounted warriors surrounded her cabin, their weapons raised, their chief's obsidian eyes fixed on the woman who held his son's life in her hands. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The spring rains had finally ceased, leaving the Arizona territory soaked and the creek behind Sarah Bennett's modest cabin swollen past its banks. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across her small plot of land, illuminating the dampness that still clung to every surface. Sarah stood at her rough-hewn kitchen table, kneading dough with practiced hands, pausing occasionally to rub the ache in her lower back. Her swollen belly, now 7 months round, pressed against the worn fabric of her apron. The cabin walls seemed to hold their breath around her, too quiet, too empty since Thomas had been taken by the fever last winter. Some days the silence was a comfort. Today it felt like a hand around her throat. "Just you and me, little one?" she whispered, patting her belly as the child within responded with a firm kick. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Strong, like your father." The isolation of her homestead hadn't bothered her when Thomas was alive. They'd chosen this plot deliberately, far enough from Willow Springs to avoid the prying eyes and whispered judgments of townsfolk who disapproved of Thomas's sympathetic views toward the native tribes. Now that solitude felt less like freedom and more like vulnerability. Sarah moved to the window, watching as the daylight began its slow retreat. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising another storm before morning. She needed to check the livestock before nightfall. With a sigh, she dried her hands on her apron and reached for the shawl hanging by the door. Outside, the April air carried a damp chill. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter as she made her way to the small barn where her milk cow and 2 horses were sheltered. The animals were settled for the night, feed troughs filled, water fresh. She patted the neck of Thomas's bay gelding, remembering how her husband's gentle hands had tamed the spirited creature. "We're managing without him, aren't we?" she murmured. As she turned to leave, a flicker of movement near the well caught her eye. Sarah froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Stories of Apache raids had increased in recent months. Retribution, some said, for the cavalry's attack on a peaceful camp 3 moons back. Just last week, Jacob Thornton had ridden through the scattered homesteads, warning everyone to stay vigilant or consider moving closer to town. "They're savages," he'd spat when Sarah had questioned whether all the stories were true. "They'd as soon take your scalp as look at you, especially a woman alone." But the figure by the well wasn't a warrior. It was small, hunched over, a child. Cautiously, Sarah moved closer, one hand protectively covering her belly. The boy, for she could see now it was a boy, couldn't have been more than 12. His slight frame was draped in bloodied buckskin, his black hair matted with dirt and pine needles. He was trying to pull himself up on the well's stone edge, but his strength failed him and he collapsed into the mud. "Dear God," Sarah whispered, rushing forward despite the voice of caution screaming in her mind. The boy's eyes flew open at her approach, dark, frightened eyes that immediately sought escape. He tried to scramble away, but a pained gasp escaped his lips as he clutched his shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining the earth beneath him. Sarah knelt beside him, moving slowly, keeping her hands where he could see them. "I won't hurt you," she said softly, knowing he likely couldn't understand her words, but hoping her tone might convey her intent. The boy watched her, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. His gaze darted to her swollen belly, then back to her face. "You're hurt," she continued, gesturing to his shoulder. "Let me help." Thunder rumbled in the distance as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. The boy shivered, and something in Sarah's chest tightened. He was someone's child, someone's son, wounded and afraid on strange land. "Come," she said, offering her hand. "Please." For a long moment, he stared at her outstretched fingers. Then, with the wariness of a wounded animal, he allowed Sarah to help him to his feet. He swayed dangerously, and she caught him, supporting his slight weight as they moved toward the cabin. Inside, she settled him on the small cot near the fire, the same place where Thomas had spent his final days. The boy's eyes took in everything: the rifle mounted over the door, the cooking pot bubbling on the hearth, the half-kneaded dough abandoned on the table. Sarah gathered clean cloths, her small jar of honey, and the bottle of whiskey Thomas had saved for medicinal purposes. The wound would need cleaning. As she approached, the boy tensed, his good hand gripping the edge of the cot. "It's all right," she soothed, showing him each item before setting them down. "This will hurt, but it will help." Outside, the storm broke in earnest, rain lashing at the windows as if demanding entrance. Sarah gently peeled away the bloodied buckskin from the boy's shoulder, revealing a jagged bullet wound. The sight made her stomach turn, but she steadied herself, remembering how Thomas had taught her to treat injuries on their journey west. "Bullets gone through," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "That's good. That's good." As she worked to clean and bind the wound, Sarah felt the weight of what she was doing settle over her. This boy wasn't just any child, he was Apache, the same people whose raids struck terror in settlers' hearts, the same people who, according to men like Jacob Thornton, would show no mercy to a pregnant widow living alone. Yet, looking at his face, tight with pain, but brave beyond his years, Sarah saw only a child who needed help, the kind of help Thomas would have given without hesitation. Thunder crashed overhead as she finished securing the bandage. The boy's eyes were growing heavy, fever beginning to flush his cheeks. Sarah placed a cool cloth on his forehead, and he murmured something in his language, perhaps a thank you, perhaps a prayer. "Rest now," she whispered, pulling a blanket over him. "You're safe here." But as the storm raged and night fell completely, Sarah wondered if either of them would be safe when morning came. The night stretched endlessly as Sarah kept vigil by the boy's side. Rain pounded against the cabin roof, occasionally finding its way through a small leak in the corner, where a tin bucket collected the persistent drips. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the shutters as if testing their strength. Sarah dipped a cloth into cool water, wringing it out before placing it on the boy's forehead. His fever had worsened over the past hours, his small body alternating between violent shivers and concerning stillness. Twice she had changed the bandage on his shoulder, the wound angry and red despite her careful cleaning. "Stay with me," she whispered, more prayer than command. "You've come this far." She found herself speaking to him throughout the night, telling him about the baby, about Thomas, about the small garden she'd planted that was just beginning to show green shoots. Perhaps it was to comfort the boy, but Sarah knew it was also to ward off the crushing silence between thunderclaps. "Thomas would have known better what to do for you," she said, adjusting the blanket around the boy's thin shoulders. He learned from a Shoshone healer when he was scouting with the cavalry, before he decided a soldier's life wasn't for him. The boy stirred at the sound of her voice, his eyelids fluttering but not opening. He murmured something in his language, the words flowing like water over stones. "That's it," Sarah encouraged. "Keep fighting." In the flickering firelight, she studied his face. He couldn't be much older than 11 or 12, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw that hinted at the man he would become. His hands, though small, were calloused. A child who knew work, knew responsibility, not so different from the farm children in Willow Springs. A particularly violent gust of wind sent the shutters banging, and the boy startled awake, eyes wide with terror. He tried to sit up, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there, only to fall back with a cry of pain. "Shh, you're safe," Sarah soothed, instinctively reaching for his hand. "It's just the storm." The boy's dark eyes fixed on her face, recognition slowly dawning through the haze of fever. His breathing calmed, though wariness remained in the tense set of his shoulders. "I'm Sarah," she said, touching her chest, then gesturing to him with an open palm. "What's your name?" He watched her for a long moment, then said softly, "Nakohe." "Nakohe," she repeated, the unfamiliar syllables awkward on her tongue. "You're safe here, Nakohe." He glanced around the cabin, his gaze lingering on the doorway, then the windows, as if calculating escape routes. Sarah recognized the look. She'd worn it herself during the early months of her pregnancy, when the thought of facing life without Thomas had seemed impossible. "You need rest," she said firmly, reaching for the mug of willow bark tea she'd prepared. She helped him sit up enough to drink, supporting his back with her arm. "This will help with the fever and pain." Nakohe sniffed the liquid suspiciously before taking a hesitant sip. His face contorted at the bitter taste, but he continued drinking under Sarah's watchful eye. "Good," she nodded when he finished. "Now rest." As she lowered him back to the cot, her hand brushed against something hard tucked into his waistband. Carefully, she extracted a small wooden carving of an eagle, its wings extended in flight. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each feather delicately rendered. Nakohe's hand shot out, grasping her wrist with surprising strength. "Shishay," he said, his voice hoarse but insistent. "Yours." Sarah nodded, returning the carving to his palm. "It's beautiful." The boy clutched the eagle to his chest, his eyes drooping as exhaustion reclaimed him. "Shishay," he repeated before slipping back into fitful sleep. Sarah moved to the window, parting the curtain to peer into the stormy darkness. What had happened to this child? Who had shot him? And were they still searching for him? The questions swirled in her mind like the wind-driven rain outside. Her hand drifted to her belly as the baby shifted restlessly within her. What would Thomas have done? The answer came immediately, exactly what she was doing now. Thomas Bennett had never turned away someone in need, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke. It was one of the reasons the townsfolk had kept their distance, whispering that he was an Indian lover when they thought she couldn't hear. "Your papa had a good heart," she murmured to her unborn child. "The kind of heart this world needs more of." As the night deepened, Sarah's thoughts turned to the morning to come. If the boy's people were looking for him, they would follow his trail, a trail that led directly to her door. The territorial tensions had escalated in recent months, with stories of atrocities on both sides spreading like wildfire. Most settlers viewed all Apache as enemies, making no distinction between the various bands or acknowledging that some had tried to maintain peace. The practical part of her, the part that had survived the arduous journey west and the loss of her husband, knew she should take the boy to town at first light, hand him over to the authorities. But the mere thought made her stomach clench. The Army's handling of native children often meant forcing them into schools far from their families, stripping away their language, their customs, their very identities. "No," she whispered, resolute, "I won't be party to that." Instead, she would help him heal enough to return to his people. It was what Thomas would have wanted. It was what she wanted. The decision made, Sarah returned to the boy's side. His breathing had eased somewhat, though fever still flushed his cheeks. She refreshed the cool cloth on his forehead and checked his bandage once more. "We'll get through this night," she promised him, "and tomorrow we'll figure out the rest." Hours passed. Sarah dozed intermittently in the chair beside the cot, jerking awake at every change in the boy's breathing, every shift in the storm's intensity. She fed the fire, made more tea, and spoke quiet reassurances when Nakohe called out in his fever dreams. Near dawn, the rain finally ceased. The sudden silence woke Sarah from a light sleep, her neck stiff from the awkward position. She rose to stretch her aching back, moving to the window to observe the first faint lightening of the eastern sky. The storm had passed, but something told Sarah the true tempest was yet to come. She placed a protective hand over her belly, drawing a deep breath to steady herself. "We did it, little one," she murmured. "We made it through the night." As if in response, Nakohe stirred on the cot, his eyes opening clearer than they had been since she'd found him. He looked at Sarah, then at the eagle carving still clutched in his hand. Something passed between them, not understanding exactly, but recognition. Two souls caught in circumstances beyond their control, finding momentary sanctuary in an uncertain world. Sarah smiled at him, about to speak, when a sound from outside froze the words in her throat. Hoofbeats, many of them, approaching fast, and they were coming straight for her cabin. Sarah's blood ran cold as the sound of approaching riders grew louder. Her hand instinctively went to her throat, then to her swollen belly in a protective gesture. Nakohe had heard it too. His body tensed beneath the blanket, eyes wide and alert despite his weakened state. "Is it your people?" she whispered, moving to the window. What she saw made her stumble back. At least 24 mounted warriors materialized from the misty dawn, like apparitions, their faces painted with red and black stripes, feathers and beads adorning their long black hair. They carried lances, bows, and she spotted the glint of rifles among them. They moved with disciplined precision, spreading out to surround her small cabin. "Oh God!" Sarah breathed, her mind racing. She glanced at Thomas's rifle above the door, but knew it would be futile against so many. Besides, any show of force would surely mean death for both her and the boy. Nakohe struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his wound. "Shiji," he said urgently. "Father," Sarah helped him upright, understanding flooding her. "Your father is out there?" The boy nodded, then pointed to his eagle carving and made a motion above his head, mimicking something large. "A headdress?" Sarah guessed. "Your father wears eagle feathers." Nakohe nodded again, his expression a mix of relief and apprehension. A commanding voice called out in Apache, the words incomprehensible to Sarah but carrying unmistakable authority. The riders halted, forming a tight circle around the cabin. One man dismounted, taller than the others, with a striking presence that marked him as their leader. A war chief, eagle feathers adorned his headdress, confirming Nakohe's gesture. Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. I need to go out there," she said, meeting Nakohe's eyes. "Will you be all right for a moment?" The boy hesitated, then gave a small nod. His eyes held a warning she couldn't quite decipher. Sarah straightened her dress and pulled her shawl around her shoulders. Her hands trembled, but she forced them still. The baby kicked vigorously, as if sensing her fear. "It's all right, little one," she murmured. "Your mama's just going to talk to some visitors." She opened the cabin door and stepped onto the small porch, her heart hammering against her ribs. The morning air was cool and damp after the night storm, the ground muddy beneath the warriors' horses. Steam rose from their nostrils in the chill. The war chief stood 20 paces from her door, his face impassive, dark eyes boring into hers. Behind him, his warriors waited in tense silence, weapons ready. Sarah fought the urge to retreat into the cabin, instead lifting her chin and meeting the chief's gaze directly. For what seemed an eternity, neither spoke. Then the chief raised his hand, palm forward, and said something in Apache. Sarah swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I don't understand." The chief's eyes narrowed slightly. He gestured toward the cabin, then made a motion like rocking a baby. The question was clear. Was she alone? Sarah shook her head. "Your son is inside," she said, pointing to the door behind her. "Nakohe, he was hurt." At the boy's name, a ripple of reaction passed through the warriors. The chief's stern expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Concern, perhaps, or suspicion. He barked an order, and two warriors immediately dismounted, moving toward the cabin with their hands on their weapons. Sarah stepped into their path, her heart in her throat. "He's injured," she said firmly, gesturing to her shoulder to indicate where. "I've been caring for him. Please, he needs rest." The warriors paused, looking to their chief for direction. He studied Sarah's face, then her swollen belly, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he nodded to his men to stand down. "Nakohe," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard. Inside the cabin, there was movement. Then the door creaked open wider, and Nakohe appeared, leaning heavily against the doorframe. His face was still flushed with fever, the bandage on his shoulder visible beneath his torn buckskin shirt. "Shizeye," he said, his voice weak but relieved. The tension in the chief's shoulders eased fractionally. He spoke rapidly to the boy, who responded in kind, his words occasionally interrupted by winces of pain. Sarah watched the exchange, unable to understand the words, but reading the emotions that passed between father and son. Nakohe gestured to Sarah several times, touching his bandaged shoulder and making drinking motions. He was explaining how she had helped him, she realized. The chief's gaze returned to Sarah, assessing her anew. He said something to one of his men, who immediately retrieved a bundle from his horse and brought it forward. The chief took it, then approached Sarah with measured steps. Sarah held her ground, though every instinct screamed for her to flee. As he drew near, she could see the intricate patterns painted on his face, the lines of authority and experience etched around his eyes. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps in his 40s, with a dignity that commanded respect. He stopped an arm's length away, towering over her. His gaze dropped to her belly, then back to her face. To Sarah's surprise, he touched his own chest and spoke a single word, Nakonedi. His name, she realized. He was introducing himself. "Sarah," she replied, touching her chest in return. "Sarah Bennett." Nakonedi nodded once, acknowledging her. Then he unwrapped the bundle in his hands, revealing dried meat, berries, and some kind of flatbread. He offered it to her. Food. He was offering her food, a gesture of peace. Sarah accepted it with both hands, inclining her head in thanks. "I gave your son medicine for his fever," she said, knowing he wouldn't understand her words, but hoping her meaning might somehow reach him. "And his wound needs time to heal." The chief studied her for a long moment, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. He turned and called to his warriors, several of whom dismounted at his command. They conferred briefly, with occasional glances towards Sarah and Nakohe. Sarah used the moment to check on the boy, who still leaned weakly against the doorframe. "You should be resting," she said gently. Nakohe shook his head. "Shizeye," he said, as if that explained everything. Perhaps it did. He needed to be present for whatever was happening, despite his condition. The chief approached them again, this time with an older warrior at his side. This man's face bore deep lines of wisdom, and he carried a small pouch at his waist. "Diyin," Nakohe said to Sarah, pointing to the older man, "medicine, a healer." Sarah felt a surge of relief, someone who might know better than she how to treat the boy's wound. The chief spoke to his son, his tone gentle but firm. Nakohe nodded, then looked at Sarah. "Go inside," he said haltingly in English, surprising her. "Diyin help." Sarah stepped aside, allowing the medicine man to enter her cabin. The chief followed, ducking his head beneath the doorframe. Sarah hesitated only briefly before joining them, leaving the door open. Outside, the warriors maintained their vigilant circle, but the immediate sense of threat had diminished. Inside the small cabin, the chief's presence seemed to fill the space. He stood silent as the medicine man examined Nakohe's wound, nodding approvingly at Sarah's handiwork. The healer spoke softly to the boy, who responded with occasional nods or grimaces. From his pouch, the medicine man produced various herbs and powders. He gestured to Sarah's kettle, requesting water. As she moved to comply, she felt the chief's eyes following her, watching her every movement. When she returned with the heated water, the chief spoke, Nakohe translating haltingly. He asks, "How you find me?" Sarah described discovering him by the well, miming her actions as she spoke to help bridge the language gap. Nakohe relayed her words to his father, whose stern expression remained unchanged. But when the boy finished speaking, the chief turned to Sarah and touched his heart, then extended his hand toward her in a gesture she instinctively understood as gratitude. The medicine man finished preparing his herbs and began applying them to Nakohe's wound. The boy bit his lip against the pain, but didn't cry out. His father placed a hand on his good shoulder, steadying him. In that moment, watching father and son, Sarah saw not the fearsome warriors of settler nightmares, but a family. A father worried for his child, a healer tending to one of their own. Not so different from any family in Willow Springs. And as the morning light strengthened, illuminating the small cabin where enemies had become uneasy allies, Sarah wondered what other truths might be revealed before this unexpected encounter reached its conclusion. The morning lengthened as the medicine man, Diyin, continued his ministrations. Sarah watched with fascination as he applied a paste of crushed herbs to Nakohe's wound, chanting softly under his breath. The boy's pain seemed to ease, his tense muscles gradually relaxing. Outside, the warriors had established a perimeter around Sarah's property. Some tended their horses, others kept watch on the surrounding hills. A few had constructed a small fire where they heated something in a clay pot. The scene was surreal, a war party camped peacefully around her modest homestead. "Your son speaks English," Sarah said to Nakonedi, breaking the silence that had settled inside the cabin. The chief regarded her steadily, then nodded. He gestured to Nakohe, who looked up from his cot. "Mission school," the boy explained haltingly. "2 summers, before we left." Sarah understood the implications. Many native children were taken, often forcibly, to mission schools, where they were forbidden to speak their language or practice their customs. That Nakohe had returned to his people spoke of his father's determination to reclaim his son. "How did you get hurt?" she asked gently. Nakohe glanced at his father, who gave a slight nod of permission. "Soldiers," the boy said, his voice hardening despite his weakness. "We hunt deer. They come." "Shoot." Anger flashed in Nakonedi's eyes, though his expression remained controlled. He spoke several sentences in Apache, his deep voice resonating in the small space. Nakohe translated hesitantly. "My father says, 3 days ago, hunting party, No weapons for war, only for deer. Army soldiers come, no talking, they shoot. He touched his shoulder. I run, get lost. And you found your way here, Sarah finished softly. The boy nodded. Water, he said, mimicking drinking. I need water. Then he made a falling motion with his good hand. Sarah's heart ached at the injustice. A boy hunting with his father, shot without provocation or warning. It contradicted everything reported in Willow Springs, where all Apache were painted as bloodthirsty raiders who attacked without cause. Yet here was evidence of the opposite, unprovoked violence against a peaceful hunting party. Diyin spoke, and Nakohe looked relieved. He says wound clean now, no bad spirits. Tell him I'm glad, Sarah replied, offering the medicine man a smile of gratitude. The cabin door opened and another warrior entered, speaking rapidly to Nakonedi. The chief listened intently, his brow furrowing. He turned to Sarah, saying something that Nakohe quickly translated, "Riders coming, white men." Sarah's stomach dropped. She moved to the window, peering out toward the road. In the distance, she could make out a group of horsemen approaching, at least 6, maybe more. It's probably Jacob Thornton and the others from town, she said, her voice tight with worry. They've been patrolling since the rumors of raids started. Nakonedi spoke sharply to his men outside. They immediately took defensive positions, though they didn't ready their weapons. Yet. Wait, Sarah said urgently, turning to the chief. If they see your warriors, they'll think it's a raid. There will be bloodshed. Nakohe translated, though she suspected Nakonedi had understood her meaning even without the words. The chief's eyes narrowed in thought. Let me speak to them first, Sarah pleaded. I can explain. Explain what? Nakohe asked, his young face troubled. White men no listen. Some do, Sarah insisted, thinking of Thomas. My husband did. I do, please, give me a chance to prevent more killing. After Nakohe translated, Nakonedi studied Sarah for a long moment, as if measuring her resolve. Finally, he nodded once and issued commands to his men. The warriors melted into the tree line surrounding Sarah's property, effectively concealing themselves while maintaining their defensive formation. The chief himself remained, along with Diyin and 2 other warriors who positioned themselves inside the cabin, out of sight from the windows. I'll go meet them, Sarah said, straightening her apron and pushing her hair back from her face. Nakohe should stay hidden. The boy didn't need translation to understand. He retreated to the small bedroom at the back of the cabin, Diyin following to continue tending his wound. Before Sarah could leave, Nakonedi touched her arm lightly. The unexpected contact startled her. His weathered hand was calloused but gentle against her skin. He said something, his deep voice solemn. My father says be careful, Nakohe called from the bedroom. And do these men have hate in their hearts? Sarah nodded. I know them. They're frightened, not evil. I'll be careful. She stepped outside, closing the door behind her. The approaching riders were now clearly visible. Jacob Thornton at the lead, followed by 5 other men from Willow Springs. All were armed, rifles at the ready across their saddles. Sarah took a deep breath and walked to the edge of her yard, one hand resting protectively on her belly. She waved as they approached, attempting to appear casual despite her racing heart. Morning, Jacob, she called when they were within earshot. What brings you all out this way? The men reined in their horses, dust billowing around them. Jacob Thornton was a large man with a bushy beard and perpetually narrowed eyes. He had never approved of Thomas's sympathetic attitude toward the native tribes, and his distrust had extended to Sarah by association. Smoke signals to the north last night, Jacob said without preamble. Apache war party spotted crossing Miller's Creek at dawn. We're checking all the outlying homesteads. His gaze swept past her to the cabin. "You alone, Mrs. Bennett?" Sarah maintained her composure, though she could feel sweat beading at her temples. "Just me and the little one," she said, patting her belly. "Haven't seen anyone since you rode through last week." Jacob's eyes narrowed further. "No visitors, no strangers passing by." "In this weather," Sarah gestured to the muddy ground. "Nobody's fool enough to travel these roads after a storm like last night's." The men exchanged glances. One of them, Will Baker, pointed to the small fire still smoldering where the Apache warriors had been preparing food. "That your cooking fire, Mrs. Bennett?" he asked suspiciously. "Bit far from the house, ain't it?" Sarah thought quickly. "I was smoking venison earlier. The smell gets into everything if I do it too close to the cabin." Jacob dismounted, handing his reins to the man beside him. Sarah's heart pounded as he approached, his boots squelching in the mud. "Mind if we take a look around?" It wasn't really a question. "I do mind, actually," Sarah replied, standing her ground. "I'm in the middle of chores, and I don't need a bunch of muddy boots tracking through my clean house." Jacob stopped before her, his imposing height meant to intimidate. "Mrs. Bennett, there are savages in these hills. Killers. They wouldn't think twice about taking your scalp, with child or not." "I appreciate your concern," Sarah said evenly, "but I'm perfectly fine. I have Thomas's rifle if there's trouble." "A woman in your condition has no business out here alone," Jacob insisted. "You should come back to town with us, at least until this Apache business is settled." Sarah shook her head. "This is my home, Mr. Thornton. I'm not abandoning it because of rumors and fear." Jacob's face reddened at her defiance. "It's not just rumors. The Wilson place was hit 3 days ago, their livestock taken, barn burned." "I'm sorry to hear that," Sarah said, genuinely distressed. "But I haven't seen any sign of trouble here." Another rider, young Caleb Parker, suddenly called out, "Hey, Jacob, there's tracks here, lot of them." Unshod horses, leading right to the property line. Sarah's blood ran cold. The warriors had concealed themselves, but nothing could hide the evidence of their arrival. Jacob's hand moved to his pistol. "You want to explain that, Mrs. Bennett?" Sarah fought to keep her voice steady. "Wild horses pass through occasionally. They come to the creek behind the property." "Wild horses, traveling in formation," Jacob scoffed. "You take me for a fool." Before Sarah could respond, the cabin door opened. Nakonedi stepped out, tall and imposing in the morning light. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were alert, calculating. The effect on Jacob and his men was immediate. Weapons were drawn, horses skittered nervously as their riders tensed. "Get behind me, Mrs. Bennett!" Jacob shouted, raising his pistol. "No." Sarah moved deliberately between Jacob and the Apache chief. "Put your gun down, Mr. Thornton. There's no danger here." Jacob stared at her in disbelief. "Have you lost your mind, woman? That's an Apache warrior on your porch." "I know exactly who he is," Sarah replied firmly, "and he's here peacefully." The tension in the yard was palpable, a powder keg awaiting a spark. Behind Jacob, his men had their rifles trained on Nakonedi, who stood motionless, his eyes never leaving Jacob's face. And in that frozen moment, with weapons poised and breaths held, Sarah realized that the next words spoken might well determine whether blood would soak the muddy ground of the home she had built with Thomas. "Jacob Thornton, you put that gun down this instant," Sarah commanded, summoning every ounce of authority she could muster. She kept her body squarely between the armed men and Nakonedi, praying her swollen belly might remind them of their humanity. "There are children present." Jacob's eyes flickered with uncertainty, though his pistol remained raised. "Children?" "His son is inside," Recovering from a bullet wound, Sarah said, her voice hard with accusation. A bullet from soldiers who shot first and asked questions never. You're harboring hostiles, Will Baker called out, his rifle still trained on Nakonedi. That's a hanging offense. There's no law against helping an injured child, Sarah countered. Or do you gentlemen make war on wounded boys now? Her words struck home. Several of the men exchanged uncomfortable glances. Jacob's pistol lowered a fraction, though wariness still tightened his features. Mrs. Bennet, he said, struggling to keep his voice reasonable. You don't understand what you're dealing with. These savages are guests in my home, Sarah interrupted firmly. And I'll thank you to show the same respect you'd give any other visitor to my property. A tense silence fell. Behind her, Sarah could feel Nakonedi's presence, solid and unmoving. She didn't dare look back at him, keeping her eyes fixed on Jacob's conflicted face. Suddenly, the cabin door opened wider. Nakohe appeared, supported by Diyin, his wounded shoulder freshly bandaged. The boy was pale but determined, his dark eyes moving from his father to the armed settlers. Please, Nakohe said in his halting English, addressing Jacob directly. No fight, no more blood. The sight of the wounded boy gave the men pause. Jacob's pistol lowered further, though he didn't holster it. You speak English? He asked, surprise evident in his voice. Nakohe nodded. Mission school, 2 summers. He swayed slightly, and Diyin steadied him. White men shoot me, 3 days past, hunting with father. He gestured weakly toward Nakonedi. Mrs. Bennet, help me. Give medicine. Give food. Young Caleb Parker shifted in his saddle. That's just a boy, Jacob, he said quietly. Can't be more than 12 or 13. Jacob's jaw worked as he processed this complication. His gaze moved from Nakohe to Sarah, then to Nakonedi, who remained stoically silent. Why's the rest of the war party here? He demanded. Don't tell me they're all wounded children. Sarah took a steadying breath. Chief Nakonedi came searching for his son. His men are here to protect their chief and the boy. They've made no hostile moves. She gestured around her untouched property. As you can see, my home stands unharmed. If they wanted violence, we wouldn't be having this conversation. From the tree line, some of the hidden warriors had begun to emerge, sensing the shift in the confrontation. They kept their distance, but made their presence known, a clear message that the settlers were outnumbered. Jacob noted this with a grimace. We're surrounded, he muttered to his men. You rode onto my property armed and making threats, Sarah pointed out. They're protecting themselves, same as you would. Nakonedi finally spoke, his deep voice resonating in the tense air. He addressed Jacob directly, speaking in Apache, his expression dignified but resolute. Nakohe translated, My father says, he comes for his son only. No war today unless you bring it. Jacob lowered his pistol completely but didn't holster it. How do we know this isn't a trick? Get us to lower our guard, then attack. Sarah stepped closer to Jacob, lowering her voice. Think, Jacob. If they wanted to ambush you, they could have done it before you even reached my cabin. They have the high ground, the numbers, and the element of surprise. Yet here we all stand, talking instead of fighting. The logic of her words was undeniable. Jacob glanced at his men, seeing the growing uncertainty in their faces. They were farmers and shopkeepers, not soldiers, men with families waiting at home. Mrs. Bennet, Will Baker called out, what happens after we leave? You'll be alone with them. The question revealed the real fear beneath their bluster, concern for a widow alone among savages. Despite everything, Sarah felt a touch of gratitude for their worry. misguided as it was. "I'll be perfectly safe," she assured them. "Chief Nakonedi gave me his word." It wasn't strictly true. No such promise had been explicitly made, but Sarah believed it nonetheless. As if understanding her words, Nakonedi stepped forward. He moved slowly, hands visible and empty of weapons. The settlers tensed, but no one raised their guns as he came to stand beside Sarah. With deliberate movements, he removed something from around his neck, a leather cord strung with turquoise beads and a small silver medallion. He held it out to Sarah, speaking words she couldn't understand, but whose meaning was unmistakable. Nakohe's voice came softly from behind them. "My father says, this is protection. All Apache see this. They know. You are friend. Under his protection, you and..." The boy gestured to her belly. "Your child also." Sarah accepted the necklace with both hands, recognizing the profound significance of the gesture. "Thank you," she said, meeting Nakonedi's intense gaze. "Tell your father I'm honored." The chief nodded once, then turned to face Jacob and his men. He spoke again, longer this time, his voice carrying across the yard. Nakohe translated haltingly. "My father says, many lies between our peoples, too much blood, but here..." He gestured to Sarah and her cabin. "Truth was spoken, life was given, not taken." "Remember this day." Jacob holstered his pistol at last, though reluctance showed in every line of his body. "Mrs. Bennet, I still think you should come back to town with us." "My place is here," Sarah replied firmly. "I've made my decision." After a long moment, Jacob nodded curtly. "On your head be it then." He turned to his men. "Mount up. We're heading back." As they prepared to leave, Jacob leaned down from his saddle, speaking for Sarah's ears alone. "Thomas was always too soft on the Indians. Looks like you inherited more than just this homestead from him." His tone made it unclear whether this was criticism or reluctant admiration. Sarah lifted her chin. "My husband was a good man who believed in treating all people with dignity. I can think of no finer legacy." Jacob grunted, then straightened in his saddle. "We'll check on you in a few days," he said, loud enough for Nakonedi to hear. "Make sure everything's still standing." With that, he wheeled his horse around and led his men back down the muddy road toward Willow Springs. Sarah watched them go, relief washing over her in dizzying waves. Only when they disappeared around the bend did she allow her shoulders to slump, the tension draining from her body. She turned to find Nakonedi watching her with an inscrutable expression. Beside him, Nakohe leaned heavily against Diyin, exhausted by the confrontation. "Your son needs rest," Sarah said, gesturing toward the cabin. Nakonedi nodded. As they moved toward the door, he paused, looking down at the necklace still clutched in Sarah's hand. With surprising gentleness, he took it from her and placed it around her neck himself, securing it with a solemn nod. Inside the cabin, Sarah helped Diyin settle Nakohe back onto the cot. The boy's eyes were already drooping, the strain of standing through the confrontation having depleted his limited strength. "You were very brave," Sarah told him, adjusting the blanket around him. Nakohe's eyes fluttered open. "You also," he murmured, "standing against your people." "They're not all my people," Sarah replied softly. "Not if they can't see a child in need instead of an enemy." As Nakohe drifted to sleep, Sarah became aware of Nakonedi, watching her from across the room. His warriors had begun to filter back from their hiding places, but he had issued orders that kept most of them outside, respecting the small confines of her home. "Your son will recover fully," she told him, knowing he wouldn't understand her words, but hoping he would sense her reassurance. "He's strong, like his father. Nakohe hadn't translated for her, but something in Nakonedi's expression shifted, a subtle softening around his eyes. He touched his chest, then extended his hand toward her, the same gesture of gratitude he'd made earlier. Sarah returned the gesture instinctively. As she did, her baby kicked vigorously, causing her to place a hand on her belly with a small gasp of surprise. Nakonedi's eyes followed the movement. He said something to Diyin, who nodded and reached into his medicine pouch. The older man extracted a small leather bundle and offered it to Sarah. "It for the child," Nakohe murmured from his cot, not fully asleep after all. "Medicine bundle, protection." Sarah accepted the gift with genuine gratitude. "Thank you. Please tell them both thank you." As she spoke, she realized that somehow, in the space of a day, her quiet homestead had transformed into a crossroads between two worlds. The Apache warriors who had arrived as potential threats were now protectors. The neighbors who should have been allies had become adversaries. And she, Sarah Bennett, widow and mother-to-be, found herself standing at the center of this unlikely intersection, cradling gifts from a people she'd been taught to fear, defying men she'd once called neighbors. The turquoise beads felt cool against her throat, a tangible reminder of the extraordinary turn her life had taken. As morning gave way to afternoon, Sarah wondered what Thomas would think of all this, and found herself certain, down to her bones, that he would be proud. By late afternoon, the Apache had established a small camp near Sarah's cabin. Several hide shelters appeared with remarkable efficiency, erected by warriors who moved with practiced coordination. 2 women had arrived, wives of warriors, Sarah guessed, bringing additional supplies and immediately taking charge of cooking. Sarah watched from her porch as this temporary village formed around her homestead. The turquoise necklace still hung at her throat, its weight unfamiliar but somehow comforting. She touched it absently, marveling at how quickly the world could change. Yesterday, she had been a lonely widow preparing for the birth of her child. Today, she was, what? A bridge between worlds, a keeper of unexpected alliances. Nakonedi emerged from the cabin where he'd been conferring with Diyin about his son's condition. His commanding presence still intimidated Sarah, but fear had been replaced by cautious respect. He approached her, stopping a respectful distance away. For a moment, they simply regarded each other in silence. Then he gestured to the camp, the question in his eyes clear even without words. "Yes, it's all right," Sarah said, nodding. "Your people are welcome here." Nakohe called from inside the cabin, his voice stronger than it had been that morning. "My father asks if the camp troubles you." Sarah smiled, touched by the consideration. "Not at all. Please tell him I'm honored by his people's presence." As Nako translated, Sarah saw surprise flicker across Nakonedi's face. The chief said something in reply, his deep voice resonant even in the open air. "He says few white women would welcome Apache near their homes," Nakohe translated. "You are different." Sarah thought of Thomas, who had always insisted on seeing people as individuals rather than as representatives of their race or tribe. "My husband taught me to judge people by their actions, not by stories told about them." When this was translated, Nakonedi's expression softened further. He spoke again, longer this time. "My father says your husband was wise," Nakohe relayed. "Many whites, they see only enemy when they look at Apache. We see same in them, too much blood between us now. Yet here we are," Sarah said quietly, "speaking instead of fighting." Nakonedi nodded, understanding her meaning even without translation. He touched his chest, then gestured to his son inside the cabin and finally to Sarah. A connection acknowledged. One of the Apache women approached, carrying a wooden bowl filled with some kind of stew. She offered it to Sarah with a shy smile, speaking softly. "She says eat," Nakohe called from his cot. "Good for baby." Sarah accepted the bowl gratefully. "Please thank her for me." The stew was rich and flavorful, made with venison, wild onions, and herbs Sarah couldn't identify. She ate hungrily, realizing she'd had nothing since the previous evening. The Apache woman watched with approval, then returned to the cooking fire. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, casting long shadows across the yard, Sarah found herself seated near the main fire. Nakohe had been carried outside on his cot so he could translate, his color improving with each hour. Around them, warriors sat in groups, some mending equipment, others talking quietly among themselves. The domesticity of the scene struck Sarah, so at odds with the fearsome tales told in town. "How did you come to this place?" Nakonedi asked through his son. "Woman alone." Sarah cradled her belly instinctively. "My husband, Thomas, and I came west 3 years ago. We built this cabin together. Her voice caught. "He fell ill last winter. The fever took him quickly." Nakohe translated, and Nakonedi's expression grew solemn. He touched his chest in sympathy. "My father asks about your family," Nakohe continued. "You parents, brothers," Sarah shook her head. "They're all back east. My parents didn't approve of Thomas or our decision to come west." The memory still stung, her father's cold dismissal, her mother's tearful but passive acceptance of his decree that Sarah was no longer welcome if she married that Indian lover. When Nakohe translated, Nakonedi nodded thoughtfully. He spoke again, his words measured. "My father says family is sacred. Your parents lost much when they sent you away." The unexpected compassion in his words brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She blinked them away, unwilling to give in to the emotions that constantly simmered beneath the surface these days. "And what of your family?" she asked, eager to shift attention from herself. "Besides Nakohe, do you have other children?" A shadow passed over Nakonedi's face. He spoke quietly to Nakohe, who hesitated before translating. "My mother died 2 winters past, sickness from white man's blankets. I have 2 sisters, living with my father's sister's family." "I'm so sorry," Sarah said sincerely. Nakonedi acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod, then continued speaking, his voice taking on a harder edge. "My father says, our people are dying, not just from bullets, from sickness. From hunger when soldiers burn our fields and take our hunting grounds, from broken hearts when children are stolen for schools." Sarah felt the weight of his words, the painful truth behind the tidy narratives of progress and civilization she'd heard all her life. "The mission school," she said gently to Nakohe, "was it very difficult for you?" The boy's eyes darkened with memories. "They cut my hair, hit my hands when I speak Apache." "Say my name is John now, not Nakohe." His voice hardened. "Say my father is savage, my mother is no word for it, but bad word." Sarah's heart ached for him. "How did you return to your people?" A flicker of pride crossed Nakohe's face. "My father came, with warriors, at night, took me home." He glanced at Nakonedi with undisguised admiration. "Schoolmen very afraid." Nakonedi smiled faintly at his son's telling, the first real smile Sarah had seen from him. It transformed his stern features, revealing the father beneath the warrior. Their conversation continued as twilight deepened, the fire casting warm light on their faces. Sarah learned of the Apache's traditional lands, now increasingly encroached upon by settlers and the army. Nakonedi, through his son, spoke of battles he'd fought, but also of peace he'd tried to broker, efforts that had often been undermined by misunderstandings or outright treachery on both sides. In turn, Sarah shared stories of her journey west with Thomas, their dreams for the homestead, and her determination to raise her child with the same open-hearted principles her husband had embodied. As night fully descended, Diyin approached to check on Nakohe's wound. The medicine man nodded approvingly at the boy's improved color and stronger voice. He spoke to Nakonedi, who visibly relaxed at whatever news was conveyed. "Diyin says I heal well," Nakohe translated with a tired smile. "No bad spirits in wound." "I'm very glad to hear it," Sarah replied sincerely. She stood with some effort, her back aching from sitting too long. "Oh, you should rest now. It's been a long day for all of us." As she turned toward her cabin, Nakonedi rose and spoke again. Nakohe translated, his voice growing sleepy. "My father says warriors will watch through night. You are safe. All Apache here will protect Sarah Bennett and her child." Sarah met Nakonedi's gaze across the fire. "Thank you," she said simply. "I haven't felt this safe since Thomas was alive." When Nakohe translated her words, something shifted in Nakonedi's expression, a softening, a recognition. He touched his chest and then extended his hand toward her in that now familiar gesture of connection. That night, as Sarah lay in her bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Apache camp outside, soft conversations, the occasional laugh, horses nickering in the darkness, she felt the baby move within her. She placed a hand on her belly, thinking of the extraordinary day and the unlikely protectors now surrounding her home. "Your father would be amazed," she whispered to her unborn child. "And I think he would be pleased." Outside, a night bird called, answered by another in the distance. The turquoise necklace rested against Sarah's throat, a tangible reminder that sometimes mercy returned 100-fold in ways one could never anticipate. Dawn broke clear and bright, the storm-washed sky an endless blue above Sarah's homestead. She woke to unfamiliar sounds, soft voices speaking in Apache, the rhythmic scraping of stone against wood, horses nickering to one another. For a moment, disorientation gripped her, until memory flooded back. The wounded boy, the warriors, the chief with eyes that seemed to see through her. Sarah dressed carefully, conscious of her swollen belly and aching back. The baby had been especially active during the night, as if sensing the extraordinary circumstances surrounding them. She plaited her hair neatly and touched the turquoise necklace, drawing a strange comfort from its weight against her collarbone. Outside, the Apache camp was already bustling with activity. Two women knelt beside the fire pit, deftly shaping cornmeal dough into flat cakes that sizzled on hot stones. Warriors checked their horses, repaired equipment, or conferred in small groups. Children, Sarah hadn't noticed their arrival the previous evening, darted between the shelters, their laughter a universal language that required no translation. As Sarah descended her porch steps, the activity briefly paused. Eyes turned to her, curious, assessing, but no longer hostile. She smiled tentatively, and after a moment, the camp resumed its rhythm, though she sensed she remained the object of discreet observation. One of the women by the fire, younger than Sarah, with a round face and quick movements, beckoned her over. When Sarah approached, the woman offered her a freshly cooked cornmeal cake, pointing to Sarah's belly with a smile and a stream of Apache words. "She says you must eat for two," Nakohe translated from where he sat propped against a log. The boy looked remarkably better this morning, his eyes clearer, his voice stronger. Tani makes best tudigan, corn cakes. Thank you, Tani, Sarah said, accepting the food with a grateful nod. Tani beamed, touching her own stomach, and then Sarah's in a gesture of shared womanhood that transcended language. She said something else, her hands moving expressively. She says her second child comes when snow falls, Nakohe explained. She asks, when your baby comes? 2 moons, Sarah replied, holding up 2 fingers. When the summer is hottest. When this was translated, Tani nodded knowingly. She spoke again, miming, fanning herself and wiping sweat from her brow. She says summer babies are strong, like the sun, Nakohe said. But very hot time for mother, Sarah laughed, the sound surprising even herself. It had been so long since she'd shared this kind of easy female companionship, the universal conversation of motherhood, of women's wisdom passed between generations. In Willow Springs, her status as Thomas Bennett's widow had created a subtle barrier, leaving her isolated in her most vulnerable time. Nakonedi emerged from a nearby shelter, speaking quietly with Diyin. Both men looked towards Sarah, then approached. Nakonedi's stern features remained composed, but Sarah thought she detected a softening around his eyes when he saw her speaking with Tani. "Good morning," Sarah greeted them, feeling inexplicably shy. "Your son is looking much better today," Nakohe translated, and Nakonedi nodded. He replied with a stream of words that his son carefully relayed. "My father says Diyin's medicine is strong, and your care was good. I will heal well." Nakohe hesitated, then added, "He asks if you slept well, with so many strange people around your home." "Better than I have in months," Sarah admitted. "Please tell him I'm grateful for his warriors' protection." This exchange was interrupted by another Apache woman, older, with silver threading her long black hair, who approached carrying something in her arms. She spoke to Nakonedi, who nodded permission. The woman unfolded a beautifully tanned deerskin dress, adorned with intricate beadwork along the neckline and hem. She held it out to Sarah, speaking softly. "Mdai, this is Nilchi, my father's sister," Nakohe explained. "She says this for you, for when baby comes. Wide here," he gestured to the front of the dress, "for nursing. Soft for new mother's skin." Sarah's throat tightened with emotion as she touched the garment. The leather was buttery soft, the beadwork exquisite, hours of careful labor embodied in the gift. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "But I can't possibly accept something so precious." When Nakohe translated, Nilchi shook her head firmly. She placed the dress in Sarah's arms and spoke again, her weathered hand briefly touching the turquoise necklace at Sarah's throat. "She says you wear my father's protection," Nakohe translated. "You give life to her nephew. You are family now. Gift is proper." Family. The word resonated in Sarah's chest like a struck bell. She clutched the dress, blinking back unexpected tears. "Thank you," she said, meeting Nilchi's dark eyes. "I will treasure it." The older woman smiled, lines crinkling around her eyes, and patted Sarah's cheek in a gesture so maternal it nearly undid her composure entirely. The morning unfolded in a similar vein of surprising communion. Sarah showed Tani and Nilchi her vegetable garden, the women communicating through gestures and Nakohe's occasional translations. The Apache women nodded approvingly at her neat rows of corn, beans, and squash, but suggested different companion plantings that would yield better harvests. They examined her drying herbs with interest, sharing their own knowledge of plants that could ease childbirth and strengthen a newborn. In return, Sarah demonstrated her spinning wheel, which fascinated the women. Nilchi ran weathered fingers over the spun wool with an expert's appreciation, speaking rapidly to Tani. She says, "Your thread is good," Nakohe called from his seat in the shade, even and strong. By midday, a strange sense of normalcy had settled over the camp. Sarah found herself sitting with Nilchi-E, learning to bead a small moccasin, while Nakonedi conferred with his warriors a short distance away. Occasionally, she would catch his gaze on her, thoughtful and assessing, before he returned to his discussions. Nakohe had been moved to a comfortable spot under an oak tree, where he drowsed in the dappled shade. His color was much improved, and Diyin had pronounced him well enough to travel in another day or two, if his recovery continued apace. The thought of their departure brought Sarah an unexpected pang. After months of isolation, the vibrant energy of the camp had filled a void she hadn't fully acknowledged. A shout from one of the perimeter guards shattered the peaceful scene. The warrior pointed toward the road, calling out a warning. Immediately, the camp transformed. Women gathered children, warriors reached for weapons, all eyes turned toward the approaching threat. Sarah stood awkwardly, her pregnant body protesting the sudden movement. Nakonedi was already striding toward her, his expression grave. "Riders," Nakohe translated from his place beneath the tree. "Many soldiers with them." Sarah's heart sank as she shaded her eyes to peer down the road. The dust cloud was unmistakable, at least a dozen horsemen approaching at a steady pace. Among them, she could make out the blue uniforms of cavalry soldiers. "Jacob Thornton," she said grimly. "He's brought the army." Nakonechti's warriors formed a protective line, arrows nocked, rifles ready. The chief spoke rapidly, issuing commands that sent several men to defensive positions around the property. "Wait," Sarah said urgently, catching Nakonedi's arm without thinking. He stilled, looking down at her hand on his buckskin sleeve, then into her face. "Please, no bloodshed. Not here, not today." Nakohe translated her plea. Nakonedi studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. He issued new orders. His men were to hold their positions but not fire unless attacked. The riders drew closer. Jacob Thornton led the party, his face set in grim lines. Beside him rode a cavalry officer, a lieutenant by his insignia, and behind them came several soldiers and more men from town. They halted at the edge of the property, taking in the Apache camp with visible tension. The lieutenant's hand rested on his holstered pistol, his posture rigid with barely contained hostility. "Mrs. Bennett," Jacob called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Step away from the savages. You're coming back to town with us now." Sarah drew herself up to her full height, conscious of Nakonedi standing at her side, a solid presence radiating controlled power. "This is my home, Mr. Thornton," she replied clearly, "and these people are my guests." The lieutenant urged his horse forward a few paces. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant James Warren, 7th Cavalry. These Apache are wanted for questioning regarding attacks on settlers and army patrols. I have orders to bring them in." "What attacks?" Sarah challenged. "Chief Nakonedi and his people have been peaceful guests on my property. The only violence I've witnessed was that inflicted on his son, a child shot by soldiers while hunting deer." The lieutenant's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Bennett, you're being manipulated. These savages are known hostiles. They've killed women and children, as have your soldiers," Sarah interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Or do the Apache women and children killed at Three Willows not count in your tally of victims?" A murmur ran through the assembled men. The lieutenant's face darkened with anger. "You're speaking like a traitor to your own kind, ma'am." "I'm speaking like someone who believes all lives matter equally," Sarah countered. "And I'm telling you now, there will be no violence on my land." Nakonedi spoke then, his deep voice resonant with authority. Nakohe called out the translation from his place beneath the tree. My father says he came only for his wounded son. He has no quarrel if you have none, but he will not surrender to those who shoot children without cause." The lieutenant scoffed. Convenient words. "If you're innocent, Chief, then come with us peacefully. Face proper questioning." Sarah had heard enough stories of what happened to Apache who came peacefully to know such questioning often ended in imprisonment or worse. She stepped forward, placing herself more fully between the soldiers and Nakonedi. "Lieutenant Warren, I was here when Chief Nakonedi arrived. I witnessed his peaceful intentions firsthand. I will testify to that before any authority you care to name." Warren's expression hardened. "Mrs. Bennett, I have orders, and I have rights," Sarah interrupted, her voice ringing with conviction. "This land is mine. These people are under my protection, just as I am under theirs." She touched the turquoise necklace at her throat. "If you want them, you'll have to go through me first." A tense silence fell. Behind her, Sarah could feel the coiled readiness of Nakonedi and his warriors, prepared to fight if necessary, but honoring her attempt at peace. Before her, the lieutenant's face revealed his internal struggle between duty and the unexpected complication of a pregnant white woman defending hostiles. It was Jacob who broke the impasse. "She's carrying Thomas Bennett's child, Lieutenant," he said, his voice gruff but reluctant. "But this territory needs more good men, not fewer women and children. Whatever's happening here, maybe we should let it be." The lieutenant looked incredulous. "You're the one who reported this situation, Thornton." "I reported Apache warriors at the Bennett place," Jacob corrected, "not a pregnant widow about to be caught in a crossfire." He gestured around the peaceful homestead. "Do you see any sign of raiding here? Any burning buildings? Any scalped settlers?" The lieutenant's gaze swept the scene, the Apache camp, the unmolested cabin, Sarah standing resolute beside Nakonedi. His shoulders slumped slightly as the rightness of Jacob's assessment registered. "3 days," he said finally. "I'll give you 3 days, Chief. Then I expect these warriors gone from this area. Back to your reservation where you belong." Nakonedi's expression remained impassive, but when Nakohi translated the lieutenant's words, the chief nodded once, neither agreement nor refusal, merely acknowledgement that he had heard. "I'll be watching," Lieutenant Warren added, turning his horse. "And Mrs. Bennett, when you come to your senses, Willow Springs will welcome you back. Until then, you're on your own out here." With that parting shot, he wheeled his mount and led the soldiers back down the road. Jacob lingered a moment longer, his expression troubled as he looked at Sarah. "Thomas would be proud of your courage," he said quietly, "but he'd be worried sick about your safety. Just be careful who you trust." Before Sarah could respond, he too turned and followed the retreating party, leaving her standing beside Nakonedi in the suddenly quiet yard. She released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hand instinctively moving to her belly where the baby kicked vigorously, as if approving her stand. Nakonedi turned to her, his dark eyes searching her face. He touched his chest, then extended his hand toward her in that familiar gesture, but this time he gently touched her shoulder, a physical connection that spoke volumes. "Ahehe," he said simply, though she didn't know the word. Sarah understood its meaning perfectly. "You're welcome," she replied softly. "We protect each other now." The next 2 days passed in a strange harmony that Sarah would never have thought possible. The Apache camp settled into a rhythm that flowed alongside her own daily routine, the two cultures existing side by side, occasionally intersecting in moments of surprising connection. Nakohe's recovery progressed rapidly under Diyin's care. By the second morning after the lieutenant's visit, the boy was able to walk short distances, though his arm remained bound in a sling fashioned from one of Sarah's old petticoats. His natural resilience, combined with youth and proper treatment, had worked wonders. He heals like river after rain, Diin commented through Nakohe's translation, his weathered face creasing with satisfaction as he examined the wound. Strong spirit. Sarah watched from her porch as Nakohe sat with several Apache children, teaching them a game involving stones and a circle drawn in the dirt. Their laughter carried across the yard, a sound that lightened her heart. It was difficult to reconcile this scene of normalcy with the tense confrontation of days before, or with the stories told in Willow Springs about savage Apache children raised for war. Nilchi joined her, offering a cup of pine needle tea. The older woman had taken to watching over Sarah with maternal attentiveness, constantly bringing her food or herbal preparations said to strengthen a mother before birth. "Thank you," Sarah said, accepting the steaming cup. "You're too kind to me." Though Nilchi couldn't understand her words, the Apache woman seemed to grasp her meaning. She touched Sarah's belly gently, then made a cradling motion, speaking softly in her own language. "She says babies need many hands," Nakohe called from his place among the children, acting as translator even at a distance. "Women help women. This is Apache way." Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. Since Thomas's death, she had resigned herself to facing childbirth alone. The local midwife in Willow Springs was competent but cold, and Sarah had few close female friends in town. The prospect of Nilchi says experienced hands and Tani's sympathetic presence during her labor was more comforting than she could express, but they would be gone tomorrow, honoring the lieutenant's deadline. Back to wherever they made their home, likely some remote canyon or hidden valley far from settlements. The thought filled Sarah with a peculiar emptiness. Nakonedi had spent much of the past 2 days with his warriors, often riding out to scout the surrounding area. Sarah suspected he was ensuring no army patrols were positioning themselves for an ambush once the 3-day grace period ended. When in camp, he moved with deliberate authority, directing his people's activities with minimal words but maximum effect. She'd noticed, however, that his path often took him past her cabin. Sometimes he would pause, watching as she hung laundry or tended her garden. Once, when she'd struggled to carry a heavy bucket from the well, he had silently appeared beside her, taking the burden from her hands with a nod of acknowledgement. These small interactions, wordless but charged with meaning, had created a strange intimacy between them. Sarah found herself increasingly aware of his presence. The breadth of his shoulders, the quiet dignity in his bearing, the way his stern features softened when he looked at his son or spoke with his sister. It was foolish, she told herself. This man was from a different world. In 3 days, he had shifted from potential threat to unlikely ally, but anything beyond that was mere fancy born of loneliness and hormonal confusion. Tomorrow he would leave, taking his people and the brief sense of belonging they had given her with him. Late that afternoon, as shadows lengthened across the yard, Sarah sat at her spinning wheel on the porch. The rhythmic motion and familiar task soothed her, providing a sense of normalcy amid the extraordinary circumstances. Nearby, Tani worked a piece of deerskin with a bone scraper, softening it with practiced motions. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew both women's attention. Sarah's hands stilled on the wheel as a single rider appeared on the road, not a soldier or townsman, but Nakonedi, returning from his scouting expedition. He rode straight to the cabin, dismounting with fluid grace. His expression was grave as he approached the porch. "Is something wrong?" Sarah asked, rising awkwardly to her feet. Nakohi hurried over to translate, his sling bouncing against his chest. The chief spoke briefly, his voice low and tense. "Soldiers," Nakohi translated. "2 camps, one to north, one to east. More than we saw before. Many guns." Sarah's stomach clenched with anxiety. Are they preparing to attack? When this was translated, Nakonedi shook his head. He spoke again, longer this time. "Not yet," Nakohe relayed. "They wait. Watch roads." "My father thinks—" The boy hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the next part. "He thinks they wait for us to leave here, then follow, attack, when away from your home. A strategic delay, let the Apache leave peacefully, then pursue and eliminate them once they were away from the complication of a white woman's protection." The cold calculation made Sarah's blood run cold. "That's monstrous," she whispered. They gave their word. Nakoa's expression was far too knowing for a boy his age. White man's word changes like wind. Nakonedi spoke again, gesturing toward the camp where his warriors were already preparing for evening. "My father says we leave tonight. Darkness helps. Different path than soldiers expect." Sarah felt an inexplicable panic rise within her. But it's too soon. "Nako's wound. I am strong," the boy interrupted, straightening his shoulders despite the obvious discomfort it caused. "Apache boy does not fear long ride." His bravado was touching but unconvincing. Sarah had seen Dien changing his bandages that morning. The wound was healing well, but a strenuous journey risked reopening it and inviting infection. "There must be another way," she insisted. Nakonedi watched her closely as Nakohi translated, his dark eyes unreadable. He replied with a single word that needed no interpretation: "No." The finality in his tone brooked no argument. He was a chief responsible for his people's safety. He'd made his decision based on harsh reality, not sentiment or comfort. Sarah nodded reluctantly, understanding even as her heart rebelled against it. "Then let me help you prepare." Extra food, bandages for Nakohe's wound. As Nakohe translated, Nakonedi's expression softened marginally. He inclined his head in acceptance of her offer, then turned to issue orders to the camp. Warriors immediately began breaking down shelters and packing supplies with practiced efficiency. The next hour passed in a flurry of activity. Sarah gathered what provisions she could spare: dried meat, cornmeal, some of her precious coffee. She prepared a packet of healing herbs for Dien, demonstrating through gestures how each should be used for Nakohe's wound. The medicine man nodded approvingly, tucking the packet into his medicine pouch with evident appreciation. Tani and Nilchi embraced Sarah warmly, speaking words she couldn't understand but whose meaning was clear. Gratitude, concern, a shared connection that transcended language. Tani pressed a small beaded amulet into Sarah's palm, closing her fingers around it with a meaningful glance at her belly. "For safe birth," Nakohe translated from where he was being helped onto his father's horse. "She says wear it when time comes." Sarah blinked back tears, touched by the gesture. "I will. Thank you." As dusk deepened into true darkness, the Apache completed their preparations. They would travel without fire, using only the quarter moon's light to guide them through the rugged backcountry that Nakonehdi knew intimately. The chief himself was the last to mount. He approached Sarah where she stood on her porch, watching the departure with an inexplicable sense of loss. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, as if committing her face to memory. Then he reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew something that gleamed faintly in the dim light, a knife with a bone handle, small but exquisitely crafted. "My father says, Take this. Nakohe translated from horseback. Keep under pillow. Keep safe. Sarah accepted the knife, feeling the perfect balance of the weapon in her hand. I'm not sure I could use this, she admitted. When Nakohe translated, Nakonehdi's mouth curved in the ghost of a smile. He replied, his voice deep and assured. He says you are stronger than you know, like river that looks calm but shapes mountains. The unexpected poetry of his words caught Sarah by surprise. She clutched the knife to her chest, suddenly unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Nakonedi continued, his gaze holding hers with quiet intensity. Nakohe translated carefully, clearly trying to capture the nuance of his father's words. He says, remember us to your child. Tell story of Nakohe, who found mercy at your well. Tell how Apache and white woman made peace when others wanted war. I will, Sarah promised, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll tell the story true. Nakonedi reached out then, his calloused fingers lightly touching the turquoise necklace at her throat, a reminder of his protection, a connection that would remain even in his absence. The brief contact sent a strange warmth through Sarah's chest. Shuhaju, he said softly. Nakohe translated from his perch on the horse. It means, I am at peace with you. The boy hesitated, then added, it is important words, rare words from my father. Sarah touched her heart, then extended her hand toward Nakonedi in the gesture she had learned from him. And I with you, she replied simply. With a final nod, Nakonedi mounted his horse. He issued a low command, and the Apache began to move out, a silent procession melting into the darkness like shadows returning to the night. Sarah watched until the last rider disappeared, the sound of hoofbeats fading until only the chirp of crickets and the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods remained. Her hand drifted to her belly, where the baby shifted restlessly. It's all right, little one, she murmured. They'll be safe, and so will we. But as she turned to enter her cabin, suddenly too quiet, too empty, Sarah wondered if she was trying to convince the baby or herself. The bone-handled knife felt heavy in her hand, a tangible reminder of dangers still lurking and promises that hung in the balance. She placed the knife carefully beneath her pillow, as Nakonedi had instructed. Then she moved to the window, gazing out at the night, wondering which stars watched over a band of Apache riding silently through the darkness, carrying with them a piece of her heart she hadn't known was theirs to take. The silence was the hardest part. After 3 days of children's laughter, women's chatter, and the steady rhythm of camp life, the sudden emptiness of Sarah's homestead felt oppressive. She found herself pausing in her chores, listening for voices that were no longer there, turning to share observations with women who had vanished into the night. The day after the Apache departed, Lieutenant Warren and his soldiers appeared at midday, dust-covered and irritable. Sarah met them on her porch, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other discreetly touching the bone-handled knife tucked into the pocket of her apron. They're gone, she said before Warren could speak. Left yesterday, heading south. The lieutenant's face darkened with suspicion. South? Not west toward the mountains. Sarah kept her expression neutral, though her heart raced at the confirmation of Nakonedi's intuition. The soldiers had indeed been planning to intercept them on the western trail. I didn't track their movements, Lieutenant, she replied coolly. I merely observed their departure. Warren dismounted, approaching the porch with poorly concealed anger. You were supposed to notify us when they planned to leave. Was I? I don't recall agreeing to act as your informant. The lieutenant's jaw tightened. Mrs. Bennett, your behavior borders on treason, harboring known hostiles, interfering with military operations, saving a child's life, Sarah interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Preventing bloodshed on my property. Those were my crimes, Lieutenant. If you wish to arrest a pregnant widow for such actions, you're welcome to try explaining that to the territorial governor." It was a bluff. Sarah had no particular connection to the governor, but the uncertainty that flickered across Warren's face suggested he wasn't willing to test the limits of his authority against a sympathetic figure like a pregnant widow. After a tense moment, he turned away. "Search the property," he ordered his men. "Check for any signs of their direction or intentions." The soldiers spread out, examining the ground where the Apache shelters had stood, studying tracks leading away from the homestead. Sarah watched silently, her hand never straying far from the knife in her pocket. They found nothing useful. Nakonedi had been too careful, his people too skilled at concealing their trail. After an hour of fruitless searching, the lieutenant remounted his horse. "And this isn't over, Mrs. Bennett," he said, his voice cold. "Those Apache will raid again, and when they do, I hope you remember you had a chance to prevent it." Sarah met his gaze unflinchingly. "When that happens, Lieutenant, I hope you remember it was your own broken promises that drove them to it." Warren's face flushed with anger, but he said nothing more. With a sharp command to his men, he wheeled his horse and rode away, leaving Sarah standing alone on her porch, trembling now that the confrontation was over, but refusing to show weakness until the last soldier had disappeared from sight. Days passed, stretching into weeks. June gave way to July, bringing oppressive heat that made Sarah's advanced pregnancy all the more uncomfortable. Her back ached constantly, her feet swelled in the heat, and simple tasks became monumental efforts. She found herself using Nilchi ES techniques for easing discomfort. Special teas, cool compresses of specific herbs, positions that relieved the pressure on her spine. The turquoise necklace remained at her throat, a constant reminder of the unexpected alliance she had formed. At night, she slept with the bone-handled knife beneath her pillow, drawing strange comfort from its presence. Occasionally, she would take out the deerskin dress and medicine bundle, running her fingers over the intricate beadwork, wondering how Nakohe's wound was healing, whether Tani's pregnancy progressed well, if Nakonedi ever thought of the widow who had stood between him and the soldiers. Her isolation deepened. No one from Willow Springs visited, not even Jacob Thornton with his gruff concern. News reached her through occasional passing travelers, rumors of Apache movements to the south, cavalry reinforcements arriving at Fort Havisham, increasing tensions along the territorial borders. Sarah listened to these reports with outward calm, though her heart clenched at each mention of skirmishes or military patrols. She found herself scanning the horizon frequently, watching for dust clouds that might signal approaching riders, unsure whether she hoped for blue-coated soldiers or buckskin-clad warriors. July brought brutal heat and infrequent, violent thunderstorms. During one such tempest, as rain lashed at her windows and thunder shook the cabin's walls, Sarah felt the first unfamiliar tightening in her lower back, different from the general ache she'd grown accustomed to, more rhythmic, more purposeful. "Not yet," she whispered, rubbing her belly soothingly. "It's too soon, little one." The sensation passed, but returned hours later, stronger. Sarah paced her small cabin, counting the minutes between these practice contractions, trying to remember everything the midwife in Willow Springs had told her during her one brief consultation months ago. "First babies often take their time," she reassured herself. "Could be days yet." She prepared as best she could, boiling water for clean cloths, arranging her bed with extra linens, setting out the birthing supplies she'd collected over the months. Her hands kept returning to Tani's amulet, drawing courage from the connection it represented. That night, as she tried to rest between increasingly insistent contractions, Sarah thought she heard hoofbeats beneath the storm's fury. She stilled, listening intently, but the sound didn't repeat, just thunder, she decided, or her own anxious imagination. Morning brought a brief respite in both the storm and her labor pains. Sarah used the opportunity to tend her animals, moving slowly but determined to complete essential chores while she still could. The air felt heavy with humidity and unspoken expectations, the calm between storm fronts mirroring the temporary ease between contractions. As she returned from the chicken coop, eggs carefully collected in her apron, Sarah froze. A single rider sat motionless on the ridge, overlooking her property, too distant to identify clearly, but something in the straight-backed posture, the stillness of observation, sent a shiver of recognition through her. "Nakonedi," she whispered, shading her eyes against the grey morning light. But even as she watched, the rider turned and disappeared over the ridge, leaving Sarah wondering if he had been there at all, or if her labor-addled mind was conjuring phantoms from her hopes. She had no time to dwell on the question. A powerful contraction gripped her as she reached the porch, forcing her to clutch the railing for support. The eggs fell forgotten from her apron, shattering on the wooden steps as Sarah gasped through the pain. "Oh, too fast," she panted when it finally eased. "Too strong." She made it inside before the next contraction hit, this one bringing her to her knees beside the bed. Fear threatened to overwhelm her as the reality of her situation crystallized. She was alone, in labor, miles from help, with a storm building again on the horizon. "Please," she whispered, clutching the turquoise necklace with one hand and Tani's amulet with the other. "Please, let us survive this." The day progressed in a haze of pain and determination. Sarah lost track of time, measuring her world in the spaces between contractions, which grew steadily shorter and more intense. She moved as Nilchi-E had demonstrated, swaying her hips through the worst pains. Kneeling when standing became impossible, focusing on her breath as Dian had taught Nakohe during his wound treatment. By late afternoon, the storm had returned full force, rain hammering against the roof as thunder rolled across the hills. Sarah knelt beside her bed, forehead pressed against the mattress, riding another wave of pain when a different sound cut through the storm's fury. Hoofbeats, unmistakable this time, approaching rapidly. Fear surged through her, temporarily overriding even the pain of labor. Who would be riding through such weather? Soldiers. Bandits. She had heard stories of opportunists who preyed on isolated homesteads during storms, knowing help couldn't easily be summoned. With tremendous effort, Sarah pushed herself upright and staggered to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could make out multiple riders approaching, at least half a dozen, moving with purpose toward her cabin. As they drew closer, her breath caught. Not soldiers in blue uniforms. Not townsmen from Willow Springs. These riders wore buckskins, their long hair streaming in the wind and rain, their faces set with determination as they guided their mounts through the storm. Apache, and at their lead, unmistakable even through the downpour, rode Nakonedi. Relief weakened Sarah's knees, sending her sagging against the windowsill. They had returned, whether by design or providence, she couldn't guess, but they had come when she needed them most. Another contraction seized her, more powerful than any before. Sarah cried out, unable to contain the sound as her body insisted on bearing down, an unstoppable force taking control. The cabin door burst open, Nilchi-E rushed in, water streaming from her clothes, her weathered face creasing with concern as she took in Sarah's condition. Behind her came Tani, and another woman Sarah didn't recognize, all three moving with the practiced efficiency of those familiar with childbirth. Nakonedi appeared in the doorway, his imposing figure silhouetted against the stormy sky. His eyes found Sarah where she knelt by the window, his expression a complex mixture of concern and something deeper, less definable. "You came back," Sarah gasped as the contraction eased, tears of relief mingling with those of pain on her cheeks. Though she knew he couldn't understand her words, Nakonedi seemed to grasp their meaning. He touched his chest, then extended his hand toward her, their shared gesture of connection. Rain dripped from his braided hair onto the wooden floor as he spoke, his deep voice steady amid the storm's chaos. Nakohi stepped in behind his father, his wounded arm no longer in a sling, though he still favored it slightly. "My father says we never left," the boy translated. "We watched, waited in hills, for time when you might need us." Another contraction gripped Sarah before she could respond, this one accompanied by an unmistakable urge to push. Nilchi was beside her instantly, helping her to the bed, issuing rapid instructions to the other women. Tane shooed the men from the cabin with firm commands that required no translation. As the door closed behind Nakonedi and his son, Sarah surrendered herself to the ancient process that had connected women across cultures and centuries. Nilchi took charge with quiet authority, positioning Sarah, checking the baby's progress with experienced hands, murmuring encouragement in a language Sarah couldn't understand, but whose meaning transcended words. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, another kind of elemental force gathered as Sarah's body prepared to bring new life into the world. Through it all, she clutched the turquoise necklace, drawing strength from the knowledge that she was no longer alone, that beyond the cabin walls, Nakonedi kept watch, his unexpected return completing a circle that had begun with a wounded boy beside her well. "The baby comes," Nilchi said through Tani's halting translation. "Now, Sarah, push with storm, bring your child into light." And as thunder crashed overhead and rain beat against the cabin like impatient hands, Sarah gathered her courage and prepared to meet her child. A child who would be born into a world more complex, more interconnected than she had ever imagined when she first discovered a wounded Apache boy beside her well. Dawn broke over Sarah's homestead, the storm having exhausted itself sometime in the night. Golden light filtered through the cabin windows, illuminating the scene within, Sarah propped against pillows, her face drawn with exhaustion, but glowing with a fierce, triumphant joy as she gazed down at the bundle cradled in her arms. "A son," she whispered, tracing one finger along the perfect curve of the infant's cheek. "O'Day, Thomas, you have a son." The baby's skin was still wrinkled and reddened from birth, his dark hair plastered to his tiny head. But to Sarah, he was the most beautiful sight she had ever beheld. 10 perfect fingers, 10 perfect toes, and lungs that had announced his arrival with a cry that seemed to shake the very rafters. Nilchi sat nearby, her weathered hands working methodically as she prepared a tea of herbs meant to strengthen a new mother. The older woman's face bore the satisfied expression of one who had guided many souls into the world, each arrival a miracle regardless of how many she had witnessed. Tani entered, carrying fresh linens. She smiled when she saw Sarah awake, speaking softly to Nilchi. "She asks if you have name for boy," Nakohe translated from the doorway, where he had been summoned to facilitate communication. The boy's eyes were wide with curiosity as he peered at the newborn. Sarah looked down at her son's face, considering she had thought to name him Thomas, after his father. But in this moment, with sunlight painting the cabin walls and Apache voices murmuring outside, another name came to her lips. "Thomas Nakohe Bennett," she said clearly. For his father, and for the boy whose life brought all our paths together. When Nakohe translated, his voice catching slightly on his own name, Nilchi-E nodded approvingly. She approached the bed, sprinkling what looked like cornmeal in a circle around Sarah and the baby, murmuring words that needed no translation, a blessing, a welcome, a prayer for protection. Tani joined her, adding her own soft words. Then she gestured toward the door, speaking to Nakohe. "She says my father wishes to see the child," the boy explained, a hint of pride in his voice. "If you permit," Sarah nodded, adjusting her blankets for modesty. "Of course." Moments later, Nakonedi ducked through the doorway, his tall frame seeming too large for the confined space. He paused just inside, his dark eyes finding Sarah and her son with an intensity that made her breath catch. Behind him came Diyin, the medicine man's face solemn but approving as he surveyed the scene. Nakonedi approached the bed slowly, with a reverence that spoke of his understanding of the sacred moment. He stopped at a respectful distance, his gaze moving from Sarah's face to the tiny bundle in her arms. "Would you like to see him?" Sarah asked softly, tilting the baby so his face was visible. Nakohe translated, and the chief nodded, moving closer. His expression remained composed, but something in his eyes softened as he looked upon the newborn. He spoke quietly, the words flowing like water over stones. "My father says he is strong," Nakohe translated, "born in thunder, spirit of storm in his blood." The boy hesitated, then added, "He says, 'Honored you use my name for your son, big responsibility. I will teach him to be worthy of it.'" Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "Tell your father his son already has many teachers and protectors, more than I ever dared hope for him." When this was relayed, Nakonedi reached into a pouch at his waist. He withdrew a small object, a carving of an eagle in flight, similar to the one Nakohe carried but smaller, clearly freshly made. With grave ceremony, he placed it beside the baby. "First gift," Nakohe explained. "Protection, strength." "Freedom," Sarah touched the carving gently, moved by the gesture. "Thank you," she said, meeting Nakonedi's gaze directly. "For everything?" The chief held her gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, a recognition, perhaps, of how far they had traveled from that first tense encounter. Then he inclined his head in acknowledgement and stepped back, allowing Diyin to approach. The medicine man examined the baby with experienced hands, nodding in satisfaction. He spoke to Nilchi-E, who nodded and mixed another herb into her tea. Then he too offered a gift, a small leather pouch containing what Nakohe explained were sacred herbs to be placed under the baby's cradle. Throughout the day, other members of the Apache band came to pay their respects. Warriors who had once looked at Sarah with suspicion now bowing their heads in recognition of new life. Women bringing small gifts of beadwork or food. Sarah received each visitor with growing wonder, this impromptu celebration of her son's birth weaving threads of connection she had never anticipated. By evening, exhaustion claimed her. As her eyes grew heavy, she was vaguely aware of Nilchi-E shooing everyone from the cabin, arranging a pallet for herself near the door so she could attend to Sarah and the baby through the night. The last thing Sarah saw before sleep took her was Nakonedi standing in the doorway, his silhouette outlined against the sunset, standing guard over her small family as he had promised. The Apache remained for 5 days, days of healing, of learning, of unexpected joy as Sarah navigated the first challenging days of motherhood with Nilchi-E and Tani's experienced guidance. They showed her how to swaddle the baby in the Apache way, how to prepare foods that would help her milk flow strong, how to soothe his cries with gentle movements that mimic the womb. Little Thomas Nakohe thrived under their collective care, his lusty cries and strong grip drawing approving nods from Diyin and the older women. Sarah watched in amazement, as fierce warriors who had once made her tremble with fear now melted at the sight of her son, offering him solemn greetings as if he were a respected elder rather than a days-old infant. Nakonehdi kept a certain distance, supervising his people's activities and maintaining vigilant watches. But his path frequently took him past Sarah's door. Sometimes he would pause, watching as she nursed the baby or sang to him, his expression thoughtful. Occasionally, he would speak a few words that Nakohe would translate, observations about the weather, questions about her comfort, once even a brief story about his own son's birth during a winter storm. These small interactions, limited by language but rich with growing understanding, created a bridge between them that Sarah found herself increasingly reluctant to see dismantled. On the morning of the 6th day, Sarah emerged from her cabin to find the Apache breaking camp. Her heart sank, though she had known this moment would come. Nakonehdi approached, his expression grave but gentle. "My father says we must go," Nakohe translated, standing at his father's side. "Soldiers will come soon. Better we are not here." Sarah nodded, fighting the unexpected tightness in her throat. "And I understand." The chief studied her face, then spoke again, longer this time. "He says you and Thomas Nakohe will always be under our protection," the boy translated carefully. "The necklace." He gestured to the turquoise at Sarah's throat. "All Apache will know it. You have place with us if ever you need." "Thank you," Sarah replied, deeply moved. "Your people will always be welcome here too." This land, she glanced around at the homestead she and Thomas had built, now transformed by the events of recent weeks. This land can be a place of peace between our worlds. When Nakohe translated, Nakonehdi nodded solemnly. He hesitated, then spoke once more, his voice lower, meant for Sarah alone. "My father says," Nakohe paused, seeming to search for the right words. "He says your heart is like mountain spring, clean, pure, giving life where others see only dry stone." The boy's face flushed slightly. "He says he will think of you when stars shine." Sarah felt heat rise to her own cheeks at the unexpected poetry of his words. "Tell him I will watch for him on the ridgeline," she replied softly. "And I'll teach our son," she emphasized the word "our" deliberately, "to know his friends when they come." After Nakohe translated, Nakonehdi held Sarah's gaze for a long moment. Then he reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching the turquoise necklace, his thumb brushing against her collarbone, in a gesture so intimate it made her breath catch. "Yeshu Huzo," he said, the now familiar phrase carrying a depth of meaning that transcended translation. "And I with you," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The Apache departed as they had come, melting into the landscape with practiced ease. Nilchi embraced Sarah fiercely before mounting her horse, speaking rapidly as she pressed a small bundle of herbs into her hand. "And for the heart, when it is heavy," Nakohe translated from atop his own pony. "When you miss those who are not here." Sarah clutched the bundle, nodding her understanding. "Tell her I will treasure it, as I treasure her teachings." Nakohe himself was the last to leave, lingering beside his father's horse. The boy's wound had healed remarkably well, leaving only a puckered scar that would someday make a warrior's tale. He looked at the baby in Sarah's arms, then at her face. "I will come back," he said in English, without need for translation. "Teach him Apache ways. Teach him his name." "I'll hold you to that promise," Sarah replied, smiling through the tears that threatened. "Be safe, Nakohe." The boy grinned, suddenly looking his age rather than the old soul who had translated such weighty exchanges. He mounted his pony with the easy grace of one born to the saddle, raising his hand in farewell before turning to follow his father. Sarah stood on her porch long after the last rider had disappeared, cradling her son and watching the empty horizon. Only when little Thomas began to fuss, rooting against her chest in hunger, did she turn back to her cabin, empty again, but somehow still filled with the presence of those who had shared it. 3 days later, Jacob Thornton arrived with supplies from town and a wary expression. He studied Sarah's face as she greeted him, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of the turquoise necklace still at her throat and the healthy baby in her arms. "So it's true," he said, dismounting slowly. "Word reached town that you'd had the child. Some were saying..." "Well, there were rumors the Apache had returned. They came when I needed them most," Sarah replied simply. "They helped deliver my son, then left peacefully." Jacob's weathered face registered disbelief, then grudging acceptance as he peered at the healthy infant. "Strong-looking boy," he conceded. "Got a name for him, Thomas Nakohe Bennett." Jacob's eyebrows shot up. "Nakohe? You named him part Apache?" "I named him after a brave boy who suffered unjustly," Sarah corrected gently, "and after his father, who believed all men deserved to be judged by their actions, not their race." The older man was silent for a long moment, processing this. Then he sighed heavily. "Lieutenant Warren's been reassigned," he said abruptly. "A new commander at Fort Havisham says he wants to try negotiating with the Apache bands instead of just hunting them down." He gave Sarah a significant look. "Seems your friendship with the chief might have changed some minds." Sarah's heart lightened at this unexpected news. "That's good to hear." "Folks in town are still talking, mind you," Jacob warned. "Not everyone approves of your choices, but..." He cleared his throat awkwardly. "And some are saying maybe there's something to learn from what happened here. My Martha sent these..." He held up a package wrapped in brown paper. "Baby things she thought you might need." Sarah accepted the package with genuine gratitude. "Please thank her for me. And Jacob." She met his eyes steadily. "Thank you for standing with me that day. It mattered." The older man ducked his head, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Did what anyone would have done," he muttered, though they both knew that wasn't true. Before he left, Jacob promised to return in a week with more supplies and news from town. His gruff concern marked the beginning of a tentative reconnection with Willow Springs, not immediate acceptance, but a gradual thawing that would eventually lead to cautious integration. Life settled into a new rhythm as summer gave way to fall. Sarah adapted to motherhood with the resilience that had carried her through all previous challenges. Little Thomas grew strong and alert, his dark eyes taking in the world with the same quiet intensity she sometimes fancied she recognized from another face. True to their word, the Apache returned periodically, always announced by a single eagle feather left at her well, always arriving with gifts and departing with the same respectful discretion. Nakohe visited most frequently, his English improving with each visit as Sarah taught him to read from Thomas's old books, while he in turn taught her words in Apache that she carefully recorded in a journal for her son. Nakonehti himself came less often, but his presence was always significant. He never entered her cabin without invitation, never stayed longer than necessary, maintaining a formal distance that respected her position as a widow and mother. Yet there was something in his eyes when he watched her with her son, something in the careful way he spoke to her through Nakohe's increasingly skilled translations that suggested possibilities neither of them were ready to name. On the first anniversary of Nakohe's arrival at her well, Sarah stood on her porch, watching the sunset paint the western hills with fire. Her son, now crawling with determined energy, played on a blanket at her feet, babbling happily to himself. A movement on the distant ridge caught her eye, a solitary rider silhouetted against the crimson sky. Though too far to distinguish features, Sarah knew immediately who watched over her homestead. She lifted her hand in greeting, touching the turquoise necklace that had never left her throat. The rider raised his hand in return, the gesture visible even at that distance, a connection maintained across the space that separated them, a promise of continued protection, of possibilities yet unfolding. As darkness fell, Sarah gathered her son into her arms, pressing a kiss to his dark hair. "Time for sleep, little one," she murmured. "And tomorrow is another day." The boy gurgled happily, reaching for the turquoise beads with curious fingers. Sarah smiled, gazing out once more toward the now dark ridge, before turning toward the warm light of her cabin. The mercy she had shown a wounded boy had returned to her 100-fold, in protection when she was vulnerable, in companionship when she was alone, in wisdom when she was uncertain. That simple act of compassion had opened a door between worlds, creating a space where understanding might grow, where ancient hatreds might gradually give way to new possibilities. As Sarah closed her cabin door against the gathering night, she knew that the story that had begun with a wounded Apache boy beside her well was far from finished. Rather, it was still being written, day by day, choice by choice. A story of bridges built where walls had stood, of healing found where wounds had festered, of light kindled where darkness had seemed impenetrable. A story of mercy, and all that could grow from such a tender seed when planted in willing hearts.